Good morning. Welcome to Allen Avenue Unitarian Universalist Church in our virtual worship service. My name is Erica Bartlett, and I'll be presenting the service today along with a few friends. Lay-led worship is a long part of Allen Avenue's history, and most of our summer services will be lay-led. And starting in the fall, we'll be welcoming our new minister, Reverend Donna Dolan. And I have a couple of announcements before we get started. This week, 1/3 of our offering will be shared with Youth and Family Outreach, or YFO. Since 1986, YFO has been serving children ages 6 weeks to 5 years and their families. YFO has a long history of connection to A2U2, and it was nominated by Sonia Tonelli. If you'd like to contribute to the offering, you can go to our website and click the donate button at the top of the page, and then choose the plate option. You can also send a check to the church. And finally, a reminder that we'll have our virtual coffee hour at 10:45 this morning, not 10:30, 10:45. And the link for that is on the website. We hope you'll join us then.
The chalice lighting words this week are from Peter Samojki. May this flame burn and remind us that each of us can offer goodness and love, and each of us can be a blessing to the world.
When I started watching The Good Place, I didn't know quite what to expect, but I was intrigued by the concept. For those not familiar with it, the premise of the show is that a woman named Eleanor died and found herself in the good place, only to quickly realize that it was a mistake and she really should have been in the bad place. At first, the show seemed like it was only a comedy. I was amused by things such as Eleanor learning that she couldn't swear and saying things like, "Oh, fork," and "holy shirt." Then there were her mishaps, like causing giant shrimp to fall from the sky and giraffes to roam around the neighborhood. But as she continued trying to avoid going to the bad place, the real theme of the show emerged. It was about what it means to become a better person. After all, for Eleanor to earn a spot in the good place, she had to learn how to be a better person. And one of the ways she did that was by studying philosophy. The show's writers even consulted with moral philosophy professors about many of the situations they worked on, and over the 4 seasons, the show explored some pretty serious topics. This isn't typical for a sitcom, but this focus on being better is something many people can relate to, because a lot of us are trying to improve. In fact, in 2017, a Marist poll found that for the first time, being a better person was the top New Year's resolution. But what does it mean to be a good person? How do you become better? And why should you try to be a better person to begin with? That's what The Good Place explored, and it's what we'll be looking at in this service, too. As you might guess, I'll be revealing quite a few spoilers about the show, although I've also had to leave a lot out. And if you haven't seen it, maybe this service will get you curious about the show and you'll check it out. Before we dive in, though, let's pause for our opening music.
Worshipper, lover of living,
Before watching The Good Place, if you'd asked me what it means to be a good person, I would have likely come up with vague generalities, such as being nice, generous, honest, and fair. If pressed, I might have added something about being kind to animals and donating to charities. But I probably would have had a harder time coming up with specifics about this in more concrete terms. Getting into those nuances is one of the things I liked best about The Good Place. It gave great examples of both good and bad behavior, and it did so in ways that highlighted just how messy and challenging it can be to become a better person. At the beginning of the show, though, the line between good and bad people seemed fairly clear because in this version of the afterlife, it was all defined by a point system. Every action someone made had a certain point value assigned, either negative or positive. And if you had a positive net value, by the time you died, you ended up in the good place. Some examples of things that earned positive points included remembering a friend's birthday, fixing a child's tricycle, petting a lamb, and saving a child from drowning. On the flip side, you'd score negative points for things like stiffing a waitress, flossing your teeth in an office with an open floor plan, taking your shoes and socks off on an airplane, and poisoning a river. I can't argue with any of these, although of course they have differing degrees of positive and negative values. Not tipping your waitress is a far cry from poisoning a river. Still, this was a fairly straightforward approach to classifying people, and the characters too initially appeared to be clear-cut. And I'll show you some photos so you can see who I'm talking about.
First, we had Eleanor, and although she should have been in the bad place, the people in her neighborhood thought she was a humanitarian aid worker, a job that most people would agree qualifies someone as a good person. Then there was Chidi, who was supposedly Eleanor's soulmate. As a professor of moral philosophy who always tried to do the right thing, it made sense for him to be in the good place. Their neighbors were two other people who had also been identified as soulmates. Jianyu was a Taiwanese monk who had taken a vow of silence, and Tahani was a wealthy socialite who had raised a lot of money and awareness for charities. Rounding out the cast were Michael, who designed the Good Place neighborhood where the humans found themselves, and Janet, a sort of walking, talking artificial intelligence. She answered questions and could use her programming to magically make things appear when people asked for them. Both Michael and Janet were part of the Good Place, so clearly they belonged. It didn't take long to realize, though, that nothing was quite as it seemed.
From the beginning, even if I hadn't known about the mistake with Eleanor, I would have suspected that she didn't truly belong. At the reception to welcome newcomers to the Good Place, she showed how selfish she was by taking all the shrimp, and she manipulated Chidi into helping her before telling him the truth about herself. And the truth is that rather than being a humanitarian aid worker, she worked for a company that sold fake pharmaceuticals to the elderly. She was also rude to environmentalists, she cheated, and she was often inconsiderate and mean to her friends. Eleanor herself admitted that she wasn't a good person in life, although she didn't think of herself as a truly bad person either, since she hadn't started a war or killed anyone. She thought of herself as more of a medium person, and she had a good point. Although she wasn't the best person, she was smart, spunky, funny, and even if she didn't want to admit it, she had a good heart. Then things got more interesting with the other characters. At the end of the first season, Eleanor realized that none of them, not even Chidi, the moral philosophy professor, had gotten into the good place. In fact, they were all in the bad place. Later, it became clear that the point system no longer worked, and it was so flawed that no one got into the good place anymore. Since the characters were in the bad place, they'd been put into situations specifically designed to torment them emotionally. And Michael turned out to be the demon who put them there. The only character who remained as she seemed was Janet, although even she evolved throughout the show. And later in the series, we were introduced to bad Janets, who were distinctly unhelpful, rude, and wanted to torture people. For the others, though, this was when the show really delved into the complexity of being a good person. First, it turned out that Jianyu wasn't a monk, or even named Jianyu. Instead, his name was Jason, and he was a stoner and petty thief from Florida who had died in a robbery attempt gone awry. On the surface, it was easy to write him off as not a very good person. But as the show went on, it became clear that at his core, he had a good heart. He would have done anything to help his friends, but unfortunately, he grew up with a father he called Donkey Doug, a father who was also a stoner and who had, among other things, been banned from Disney World for biting Buzz Lightyear. This didn't put Jason in a good position to learn right from wrong or to understand the consequences of his actions. That didn't excuse what he did, but it did make me wonder how he might have turned out in different circumstances. On the flip side was Tahani. Even before finding out she had been sent to the bad place, I questioned whether she was truly a good person. She was very image-focused and so narcissistic that when the characters got to choose an animal companion, she didn't pick a puppy or a kitten. Instead, she chose a centaur, a half-human, half-horse, and the human half was a copy of Tahani herself, so that way she could admire herself even more. But what ultimately sent Tahani to the bad place was her motivation. None of her charity work had anything to do with actually wanting to help people. She did it in an attempt to win her parents' affection and outshine her sister. As a younger sibling myself, who grew up with an accomplished and talented older brother, I can understand feeling the pangs of sibling rivalry, but not to the extent Tahani took it. In fact, she died while trying to pull down a statue of her sister. But again, once I learned more about Tahani's upbringing, her behavior made a little more sense. While she seemed to have everything, beauty, intelligence, wealth, she didn't have parents who believed in her. They raised her to think she was never good enough, and she only became a better person when she reconciled with her sister and stopped trying to earn her parents' praise. Tahani's situation also reminded me that money can't make up for anything you do. If your actions hurt people or the environment, money won't automatically make that better. This was something the show's creator, Michael Schur, wanted to call out. In one interview, he said,
"One of the worst trends in the world to me is this thing where people will do something extravagant and then they'll take an equal amount of money and donate it to a charity, like a global warming charity. It's like a weird medieval paying for your sins thing. I mean, obviously it's good to donate that money to charity, but you can't buy yourself out of sin."
This got me thinking about my own charitable donations. Do I donate because I truly want to help people, or because I want to feel like a good person? Am I trying to balance out other actions that aren't as noble? Do I use it as an easy way out so I don't have to deal with the people doing the work or the people who need help? And I realized that my own motivations are a bit more complex than I thought. On that note, let's pause for a moment of musical meditation before talking about the other characters. Of all the characters in The Good Place, the one I most identified with was Chidi. He loved books and learning, he wanted to be a good person, and he always tried to tell the truth. He weighed the pros and cons of everything to find the right path, and he thought he ended up in the bad place because he kept drinking almond milk even after he found out it wasn't environmentally friendly. But of course that wasn't it. The real reason he was in the bad place is because all that analysis made him so neurotic that he found it almost impossible to make a decision. Even when he tried to do something as straightforward as choosing between two hats, it took him almost an hour and a half because he kept considering all the possible implications. Was the hat made by workers who were well paid? Was it made out of sustainable material? If he chose a particular hat, would that offend someone? And so on. Even simple decisions like this gave him a stomachache. The biggest problem, though, is that Chidi's constant moral balancing led him to ignore the needs of others in his life and how his behavior impacted them. For example, when a friend asked Chidi to be the best man at his wedding, Chidi couldn't figure out how to do that. He was too indecisive about what he might say for his speech, what kind of bachelor party to throw, when to start planning, and more. And for quite a while, he was oblivious about how this indecisiveness hurt his friend. Although Chidi started off as a good person in many ways, he still needed to become better. And he did when he learned not to spend so much time agonizing over decisions. He could still consider the implications, but being paralyzed by indecision wouldn't help him or anyone else. Eventually, he got to the point when he could make a decision, stick with it, and trust that he'd done the best he could. Chidi was an extreme example, but we've all had times when we have trouble deciding on what's best in a difficult situation. For example, recently, we've all had to weigh the risks of the pandemic against other needs. Or we might compare the dissatisfaction of staying with a job we don't like with the risks of doing something new that could turn out to be worse. Trying to make these decisions can sometimes bring us to a standstill. In the show, these problems of analysis paralysis also came up with the Good Place Committee. When the characters in the show finally got to the real good place, they discovered it was run by a committee, something we Unitarian Universalists can identify with. The problem is, the committee was completely ineffective. They wanted to overthink everything to make sure they kept to the highest possible moral standards. When asked if they'd consider changing the point system for getting into the good place, a system they knew didn't work, they said they needed to form another team to investigate, and that forming the team alone would take 400 years. They were so concerned with doing the absolute right thing that they didn't do anything, which meant more people went to the bad place when they shouldn't have. As the character Michael noted, the Titanic is sinking and they're writing a strongly worded letter to the iceberg. This is something I sometimes struggle with as well. My perfectionist tendencies can make me feel like I shouldn't do something if it won't be perfect, even if it will be better than what I was doing before or better than doing nothing. Seeing the example of the Good Place Committee helped remind me how damaging this can be. On the flip side, the Good Place also showed how helping others in a selfless way makes someone a better person. Eleanor's transformation was one example. She spent hours learning about moral philosophy from Chidi, but just as important, for the first time she found people she truly cared about who also cared about her. Almost despite herself, she discovered that she wanted to help her friends. In the process, it became clear that although she hadn't started off as a good person, she had good instincts, but had never been put in a position to use them. The result of all of this is that she went from being the kind of person who couldn't be bothered to think of others, to being someone who risked herself to help others. At one point, she tried to sacrifice herself by going to the bad place so that everyone else would be happy. And at the end, she let Chidi go, even though he truly was her soulmate, because leaving was right for him. As she said, "I proposed a rule that Chidi shouldn't be allowed to leave because it would make Eleanor sad, and I could try to distract you forever, and I'd still never find the justification for getting you to stay, because it's a selfish rule. I owe it to you to let you go." Then there was Michael, the demon who started off as a bad guy but then grew attached to the humans. He eventually became so invested in the happiness of Eleanor, Chidi, Tahani, and Jason that he risked his immortality and easy existence to help them. Michael even joined the others in learning about moral philosophy from Chidi, and this included turning thought experiments into more concrete examples. The best illustration was the trolley problem. If you're not familiar with it, this has you imagine that you're on a runaway trolley, and if you stay on the current track, you'll hit and kill 5 people. But you could switch tracks and kill 1 person instead. My first instinct in this situation is to switch the track to the 1 person, thinking that's better to impact 1 life than 5. But Chidi pointed out that it gets more complicated if you know who the 1 person is, or know something about one of the people in the group of 5, for example, that one is a serial killer. For most of us, this is just a mental exercise, but in the show, the characters found themselves on an actual trolley and had to make those decisions in a split second. There was no time to weigh pros and cons. The characters also talked about why this is different than killing a person deliberately and using their organs to save the lives of 5 other people. These examples helped Michael learn right from wrong, and he also learned the importance of helping others. He summed it up by saying, "Sometimes, when you're feeling helpless, the secret is to help someone else. Get out of your own head. Trust me, the next time someone asks for help, say yes." This type of behavior, of putting others first, of helping people, even when there's no clear reward for yourself, is ultimately what the show seemed to define as being a good person. But it's not only about what you do. Your intentions and motivation also matter. Are you trying to improve yourself? Are you actively working on being generous, kind, and interested in the world and people around you? Are you helping others? And are you taking action without being paralyzed by indecision? If you can say yes, then you're likely a good person, or at least trying to become one. And it seems that others agree with this. According to Imam Khalid Latif, executive director of the Islamic Center at New York University,
quote, "I would say that a strong basis to knowing you are a good person can be rooted in reflecting on how you treat those who are underserved and underprivileged in relation to you. The ones that I could fully get away with treating poorly or not even doing anything for, what am I doing for them?"
Then we have the golden rule, which reminds us to treat others as we would want them to treat us. And from a UU perspective, while we don't specifically state what it means to be a good person, our principles offer some guidance. It seems clear that to at least be a good Unitarian Universalist, we should work towards affirming and promoting our principles, including ones of justice, equality, democracy, and recognizing our interdependence with the rest of the world. But there's one other important question that the show brought up. Why be a good person? Before we get to that, let's pause for some music. When I think about why it's important to be a good person, I don't think of religious reasons. I just think it's the right thing to do. But even if it's the right thing to do, being a good and moral person isn't always easy or very fun. In fact, trying to maximize ethical behavior by being what moral philosophers call a happiness pump isn't necessarily a good thing. As Harvard University professor Joshua David notes in his book Moral Tribes,
quote, "If you push yourself just shy of your breaking point, You may do more good directly with your personal efforts, but you may undermine the larger cause by making an unappealing example of yourself.
The show illustrated this with a character named Doug Forsett. As a young man, Doug got high from magic mushrooms, and he had a revelation about how the point system worked to get into the afterlife. He then spent the rest of his life trying to maximize his points. This included reducing his environmental impact by eating only radishes and lentils, drinking his own filtered urine so as not to dirty clean water, and walking everywhere, even hundreds of miles, instead of driving, to make a donation to a charity. I'm sure that Doug minimized his carbon footprint, and he clearly earned a lot of points in the show, but I had no desire to follow such an extreme path. Another challenge with being a good person came up with Eleanor. In season 2 of the show, the 4 main characters had a chance for a do-over. They were sent back to their lives the moment before they died, and then Michael saved them so they could have a second chance to improve themselves in life. The near-death experience was a wake-up call for Eleanor, and even though she didn't remember her time in the good place, she did her best to become a better person. She quit her job selling fake pharmaceuticals and instead joined an environmental group. For 6 months, she campaigned for the environment, cut back on her meat consumption, and in general tried to be a nicer person. The result? Her friends made fun of her for trying to be vegetarian and for being nice. She made so little money she couldn't afford much of anything. She felt like nothing she did made any difference. As she said, "I've been nothing but good for like 6 months, and all I have to show for it is this crummy apartment, a lawsuit, a loose caboose, and an overdrawn bank account. Being good is for suckers." Like many people, Eleanor had expected some kind of reward for trying to do good. This is what's called moral desert in philosophy, the idea that the universe will recognize our efforts and give us something to make it worthwhile. I've occasionally felt this way too, thinking that if I do something kind or helpful, karma should bring that back around to me. But just as often, I run into the situation where no good deed goes unpunished. A lot of people struggle with this, and some think their reward will come in the afterlife. But what if you don't believe in an afterlife, or at least not that kind of afterlife? Why be a good person? When Eleanor asked Michael that question, he answered it with another question. What do we owe to each other? This prompted Eleanor to look up the question online, and it led her to a video by Chidi, back at his job as a moral philosophy professor. What We Owe to Each Other is also the title of a book by real-life Harvard moral philosophy professor T.M. Scanlon, and the ideas presented in it are what the show comes back to in the end. The book is based on the concept of contractualism. In this approach, the point of morality is to live up to our duties to each other. This idea of shared responsibility also came up in recent real-world events, when Trevor Noah of The Daily Show reflected on the killing of George Floyd and what it means to be a society. He said,
"What is society? Fundamentally, when you boil it down, society is a contract. It's a contract that we sign as human beings amongst each other. We sign a contract with each other as people, whether it's spoken or unspoken. And we say, amongst this group of us, we agree in common rules, common ideals, and common practices that are going to define us as a group. That's what I think a society is. Think about how many people who don't have, the have-nots, say, you know what, I'm still going to play by the rules, even though I have nothing, because I still wish for the society to work and exist."
This idea of owing each other something, of sharing a social contract that connects us and makes us rely on each other, makes a lot of sense to me, but it's difficult for some people to imagine. For example, in The Good Place, Eleanor was blown away by the idea that being a good person is about how we relate to each other and to the world around us. And yet, this is something we as UUs are very familiar with. We recognize as one of our 7 principles that we're part of the interdependent web of existence. I know that even if I don't get a reward for doing something good, the way I treat someone will stay with them, and it might encourage them to be a little kinder to the next person, and so on. Of course, relating well to each other isn't always easy, and we won't be perfect at it. But being perfect isn't the point. As Michael Schur noted,
you just have to think about it. You have to think all the time about what you're doing and whether you could be doing something a little more, a little better, a little differently.
or perhaps a better way to remember it is how Chidi concluded his lecture. We choose to be good because of our bonds with other people and our innate desire to treat them with dignity. Simply put, we are not in this alone. That's a good reminder for all of us in these times of isolation and societal unrest. We may be apart, but we are still connected, and we still owe it to each other to be better, to treat one another with respect and dignity, regardless of our race, gender, sexual orientation, or anything else. And if we do that, we'll have an easier time remembering that truly, we are not alone.
When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we trust the wisdom in each of us, every color, every creed and kind, and we see our faces in each other's eyes, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we tell a story from deep inside, and we listen with a loving mind, and we hear our voices in each other's words, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we share the silence of sacred space, and the God of our heart stirs within, and we feel the power of each other's faith, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place.
And our closing words are by John Wesley. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. Go in peace and blessed be.